Hi, everybody. My name is Estela Quiñones. I'm a fellow at QSide, and it is my great privilege to introduce our next speaker, Keisha Knight. Keisha is an ex-dancer, film programmer / moving image curator, an interrogator of visual culture. She has a BA in Comparative Religion from Barnard College, an MA in Media Studies from Pratt Institute, and she is a doctoral candidate in film and visual diversity, where her research focuses on visual archeologies of Blackness in the 19th century. So Keisha is currently a visiting faculty at Bennington for the 2021 through 2022 academic year and has recently been appointed as the Director of Funds and Enterprise Program at the International Documentary Association. Thank you so much for being here, Keisha. Take it away.
Here we go. So the title of this talk is called Relational Data. And like I said, I was terrified, and now I'm just a little bit embarrassed. But anyway, moving on. Jude assured me that interdisciplinarity was part of the mission, and so I am going to take his word for it. We'll go to the next slide. So this talk, Relational Data, is divided into roughly two parts. And the first part of this, I'm going to examine what I mean by this word relational. Next slide, please. Right before that one, the one with the purple highlight. Yeah. So basically, it seems like a common sense word, but I'm actually using it in a very particular way. And I'm going to kind of focus on that. I thought kind of diving into that a little bit could be really generative. And for the second part of the talk, I'm going to introduce you to a page from a newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, from 1854 that I work with really closely, and introducing it to you as kind of an offering of a way of thinking about data from a visual cultural perspective, and perhaps defamiliarizing a little bit the way that we think about data visualization. And I'm particularly thinking around the Black body. And if we have time, which I think we will, I'll take us on a quick tour of other types of racialized data visualization, or at least that's what I'm calling them, that we see across the 19th century. So next slide, please. Is there a problem with the audio? Low in volume. Is that better? Hopefully. So this talk was actually born out of a conversation last fall when I was moaning about how a certain set of funders found it very difficult to fund the work that we do at Sentient.Art.Film. So Sentient.Art.Film is a distribution initiative that I started in 2018 around film distribution and increasing access for marginalized filmmakers, for filmmakers who are working kind of pushing the boundaries of different aesthetics. But one of the things that was really important to us, especially as it developed into an artist fellowship program and artist development program, was that we didn't want to be reducible. We didn't want to be reducible to a single positionality. We didn't want to be reducible to a single genre or point of view. And so those of you who have tried to get funding, which I'm sure many people here have, you know that being able to box yourself, right, to brand yourself or even position yourself is pretty key, right, in the funding world, so that you can be quantified and you can provide value for the institution in addition to doing your own work, right? So I was pretty frustrated, and it really got me thinking, and in this conversation, I brought up this concept of opacity. And so this comes from the Martinican poet and philosopher Edward Glissant. And next slide, please. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this idea of opacity, it might seem like a strange thing to advocate for the right to opacity for everyone. But maybe you'll understand a little bit once I explain a bit more. So next slide, please. So for Glissant, there's a contrast between opacity, which he sees as the right not to be reduced, as a certain kind of relational practice where you're negotiating visibility and invisibility, and transparency, which for Glissant is a kind of imperial Western urge to reduce, to know. In the past, you might call it othering, right? to box off, make hierarchies, taxonomies so that populations can be controlled, populations, bodies, resources, right? So transparency is this kind of taxonomical practice, whereas opacity is what we can think of as a relational practice. And so the relation in the title of this talk, Relational Data, actually comes from this idea of opacity. Next slide, please. So there's also an element that I'd like to kind of add in Glissant's Poetics of Relation, where human behaviors are fractal in nature, is something that he puts forward. And so, of course, this is a certain theory of accumulation, right? It's a certain kind of way of thinking that the micropolitics that we enact on a small scale, we can find in repetition and mirroring elsewhere. So perhaps this call for opacity on a more kind of embodied relational individual scale can actually find expression in more infrastructural ways. So for the purposes of answering the question, next slide, what is a relation? And then tap again for the answer. Yeah, so we're going to define it as a process through which one negotiates one's opacity. Or alternatively, we could say something like, next slide, a process through which one advocates for one's right not to be reduced. So the next slide, please, Jude. So thinking about relational data, when I was kind of running all of this through my mind, I came up with the definition, data that refuses reduction in taxonomy, and that just felt to me as a layperson impossible, right? There always has to be a set, right? There always has to be some kind of boundary or limit. And so I thought that a way to make it seem more possible, and actually a way that is very much in line with what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about relational data, is, next slide please, Jude, is adding that word processes. So data processes that refuse reduction, which could mean processes of collection, processes of circulation, implementation, the data processes that refuse the urge to reduce, and obviously are very much, that's a kind of thought that's very much in line with this conference. So I'm going to take this talk a little bit into myself before bringing us into the 19th century to have a little tour of this newspaper I was talking about, and then of a few other images. So next slide, please, Jude. So for myself, my life is actually divided into two parts, at least, but for purposes of this talk, two parts. Industrial practice, which is my practice at Sentient.Art.Film, and also this new role that I've taken on at the International Documentary Association, and scholarly practice, which focuses on visual cultural techniques of representation, particularly around the Black body across film and different other media. So these might seem like very different concerns, but they're actually quite aligned. They're both coming from what I call, next slide, following Lisa Park's an infrastructural disposition. So really thinking infrastructurally about how power, relationships, how images are kind of circulating through these infrastructures, whether they're visible or invisible, right? And how that is kind of creating the reality that we are existing in. So for the industrial side, the question that really spurs the practice is, tap. How does the circulation of images create space? So the hypothesis here is that by moving and circulating images differently, we can create more free and equitable space. So I won't go into too much detail here about what circulating images differently means, because it's a lot of things that are sometimes just very banal and other times a little bit more exciting, but it basically involves deepening deepening relationships and having more relational business practices, having extremely intentional curation that kind of takes a broad view of both what's in the frame and what's around the frame. And then trying to make sure that everyone's growing from the interactions. That means all stakeholders, right? Top down to bottom up. So artists, exhibitors, streamers, audiences, funders. And we can't always ensure this, right? But it's more about kind of creating the awareness of this as we go into the practice of kind of doing this distribution and circulation work, and also now funding work as well. And so this question, how does the circulation of images create space, is actually mirrored in my scholarly work, or scholarly practice, as I'd like to think about it, where I'm asking the question, how does the circulation of images foreclose space? So this is actually a bit of a straw man, since my actual goal is to understand how power is working to foreclose space, and then hoping we can open it up again by just the highlighting of it, and also by the way we produce knowledge around it. So with that, I'll move to a page of the newspaper. So this is the Baltimore Sun from September 27th, 1854. And from a visual cultural perspective, we can see it as an image, right? It's an image of a newspaper. It's also an image filled with lots of images. It's an image filled with lots of symbols. It's an image filled with lines and words and blobs, and different types of representations, right? And then from a data science perspective, maybe we could see this in my poetic data analysis, let's say. We could see this as a data set, right? And that one thing that I would argue that this data set, if we're calling it that, shows, this data set of the newspaper, is actually the banality of the violence of slavery. In choosing this page from the paper, I actually chose it quite at random, kind of for the purpose or for the practice of understanding the kind of ubiquity of the circulation of this banal violence of slavery, which I'm going to go into a little more in depth now by analyzing this page of the newspaper. So you can see the columns, and there's a column there. The way I'm looking at it, it's the second column from the right. And if you look down at the bottom of that column, you'll see a bunch of little dots, right? So if we go to the next slide. So those dots are actually advertisements with the icon, what I like to call a non-consensual icon of the fugitive slave or the runaway. As you can see in this column, there are lots of other icons too that are advertisements for eye care, for papers, for wagon wheels. And so there's a certain flattening that's going on. I just wanted, in the next image, Jude, the next slide, we can see a close-up of these ads. So we're moving a little bit closer. You can see the icon, the non-consensual icon, and also the language that surrounds it, advertising for runaway fugitives. And then if you can see in the next column to the right, actually, then on this frame, actually asking for bodies to buy, okay? And so in the next slide, I just wanted to show that if we're thinking about this as a certain visualization of like some kind of data about slavery and about the way that these bodies are being circulated or being thought of imaginally in the collective consciousness, you can see here there's no sense of scale, right? The fugitive body is the same size as the steamer, as the omnibus. There's no sense that there's any scale to this. And if you go to the next slide, there's also no sense of content. It's basically like Facebook Marketplace. There's just, everything's up there. You know, you have fugitive slaves, you have doctors kind of like putting their services through. You have, empty papers, anything, except we're talking about bodies being bought and sold, right? So there's a certain flattening of everything that's happening that kind of really reduces and makes this just completely banal. It also is the same as another way of visualizing Black bodies at this time is actually through words and through listing, this is a type of listing, a combination of word and image. But if we go to the next slide, you'll see here an advertisement listing the sale of enslaved people, along with tools, mules, and hogs, and kind of continuing that just kind of listing going down. Again, another form of flattening, another form of kind of circulating enslaved bodies. So I wanted to come back to the next slide, please. So this is a really good example of what we're talking about, right? When we're a visualization anyway of what we're talking about when we're talking about reduction, when we're talking about this like need to reduce and kind of to then move around meaning through those reductions. So in this way, you could actually see this newspaper as a tool of transparency or a technology of reduction in a way. So in the last couple of minutes that I have, I just wanted to take you through a few. I can answer also more questions about the newspaper. I look at it quite a lot. I wanted to take you through a few other examples of what I consider racialized data visualization in the 19th century, and we'll come up to 1900 is where we'll end. So the 19th century was like, people were really into taxonomies in so many ways. I've left out some of the more violent visualizations, but the one that comes to mind to me always immediately is of Sarah Bartman, who very famously, apart from being toured around as a like exotic performance and spectacle, was included along with animals in a certain kind of book on nature in the natural world, right? So natural world. So again, this kind of making non-human certain bodies, and yeah, I decided not to show that one. I just chose not to. I don't want to like redo the harm of that image, but I just wanted to mention it nonetheless. So the next image, though, is also I find also obviously quite violent. So the next one. And yet, this is actually, in this time, it's data used for social justice, in fact. This is a Plymouth Committee, which is a Quaker abolitionist group. And this is a obviously very, very famous engraving of the bodies on a slave ship, which was used at that time to show the horrors of slavery, and was reprinted, posters, and remediated to the contemporary moment, right, through different art exhibitions. So this is an example of data visualization that was very impactful, though it's still kind of operating through obviously reduction, and also I would say like through the use of non-consensual symbols there with the bodies on the ship. The next image, please. Here's an example, two examples from art history. So this is Jean-Baptiste Carpeau. The sculpture is amazing. They feel like they're lifelike, coming to life. But they're also examples of kind of the typification that was happening on the time around racial science. So you have on the right what's called Bust of a Chinese Man in English, Le Chinois in French, so like the Chinese, right, this type of the Chinese. And on the left, you have the very famous Why Born a Slave, which is at one level kind of honoring like the abolition in France, but at the same time making the type of this slave. Now that said, it's a little complicated because these faces are actually quite unique, and yet they're being kind of enclosed in the discourse of typing. I just wanted to show the next slide, please. I'm almost running out of time here. So this is, again, just moving it to photography. Photography obviously continues this lineage. And here we have one of the early photo books from John Thompson, Illustrations of China and Its People, kind of trying to show the Chinese type. Photography was also used to document the type of the mentally ill, the type of the hysterical woman, and also kind of the criminal type, being the famous examples. And then there's another element with photography of this kind of indexicality, right? This truth value that kind of made it seem even more undeniable, even more kind of total, right? So if we're thinking again back to transparency, total knowledge, total reduction and control. And finally, I wanted to end with, some of you may be aware of this. Next slide, please. This looks a little bit more like what we would think of as creative data visualization that we would see today. This is from 1900. Incredible book of W.E.B. Du Bois's data visualizations that he took with him to the American Negro Exposition at the Paris Exposition, in 1900. So this here shows, the number of slaves until emancipation, just a data visualization of that. And the final slide that I wanted to show, just another data visualization from this of city and rural populations in 1890. So again, these are a lot closer to what we see today in terms of data visualization, but I would argue that all of the images that we saw up to this point, we can think of as certain types of data visualization, even if it's a certain kind of ideological visualization, particularly like when we're thinking about the newspaper. So thank you for listening. I know this is a little bit different than a lot of the other talks today, but hopefully it opened up some space for you, and has been useful in a way of kind of thinking through questions you have maybe a little differently. So I'm happy to take any questions or comments that might have come up during that.
Thank you, Keisha. I think that these kinds of historical contextualizations for some of the work that we do are really important. So I appreciate you participating when I know you, you sort of shared with me on a personal level, you were like, am I going to fit in at this conference? But I think these kinds of pieces and this interdisciplinary understanding of kind of the historical legacy that we're drawing from around some of this is really important, and actually can be quite instructive about some of the nuances and the complexities of the work that we're trying to do. And this idea of reductionist and flattening out is something that I think, especially as the data get large, that we have to think about really very carefully.
Well, one reason that I actually decided to work in the 19th century, when it would seem to make much more sense for me to think about cinema or VR, immersive media or something like that, right? Something that seems more on trend, is this idea that there's something about defamiliarizing the processes that we're, the kind of technological moment that we're in, that can kind of highlight the deeper logics that might be coming through. That's the idea anyway.